Welcome back to The Heat. We're talking about the U.S. airstrikes in Iraq. Joining me now is Mann Leverett. She has 25 years experience in U.S. foreign policy. Also with us is retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. Welcome to both of you to the show. Hillary, we have been here before. Make of these latest developments.
Yeah, incredibly. You know, President Obama is now the fourth U.S. president in a row to order military action in Iraq, which some refer to, I think, accurately as the graveyard of American ambition. And I think that's the big strategic picture here, that regardless of what we bomb or how much we bomb, this is the graveyard of American ambition. The invasion of Iraq and the continued occupation and now the blowback that we're receiving puts the United States, I think, in a dire strategic corner. If we bomb, we are likely to galvanize Sunni Muslims across the Muslim world, not just in the Middle East. It's not going to be everybody, but we're likely to galvanize a strong recruitment tool for the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. If we don't bomb, we could face a really serious confrontation in or around Erbil, where the United States has thousands of people, not just in the American consulate and all the associated U.S. government agencies there, but a lot of businessmen from oil companies and other places. So we're really, I think, in a very serious, if not dire, strategic corner.
All right, Cedric, do you agree that these strikes could prove counterproductive to American interests?
Potentially they could, and the reason for that, Anand, is because if you attack a certain area and you have two choices. Either you don't finish the job from a military perspective, there could be blowback from the opposition, or you could have a situation where you don't do enough and it's not blowback, but it's a continuation of what the Islamic State in Iraq is trying to accomplish. So what they're trying to do, I think, is create the situation so that they can actually take over as much territory as possible in the least amount of time, and then they'll wait out in certain areas. And Erbil is one of those areas where you see the possibility of a siege occurring or a blockade of some type occurring. And if that happens, that is going to be what Hillary spoke to. That is going to be a dire situation. It could result in political and military consequences that are as yet unforeseen.
Right, Hillary, when we look at the action that Washington has taken, the IS, Islamic State, is not a group that just emerged yesterday. They've been there for some time. So why now this response from the United States?
Well, it's a problem the United States has had for decades. And it's a bipartisan buy-in by the foreign policy elite here in Washington. First training the Sunni Islamist militias in Afghanistan in the 1980s to oust the Soviets. And then in more recent times, the Bush administration strategy, what was called the surge, was really about arming, funding, and trading 80,000 Sunni Islamists inside Iraq. And then President Obama on his watch armed, trained, and funded Islamist militias in Libya and so-called moderate opposition in Syria. So the why now, I think, is that we have been, over the years, pursuing these policies that are not only counterproductive, but in recent history, the past 3 years, have fed upon themselves. So we've destroyed the state in Libya, opened it up to an Islamist internecine militia battle zone, the same thing in Syria, and we continued to turn a blind eye to that happening to Iraq. These three battlefields, in a lot of ways, are melding together. The fighters are melding together. ISIS is not made up of primarily or overwhelmingly Iraqis. There are people there they're Chechens from Russia, there are Uyghurs from China, there are Saudis, there are Tunisians, there are lots of other nationalities there. So this idea that we're constantly presented here in Washington, that well, if Prime Minister Maliki were just more inclusive, this wouldn't be a problem, is really strange on its face, because there is no government in Iraq, Prime Minister Noor Maliki or anybody else, who could be more inclusive of a terrorist organization that has significant foreign fighters within it. That just can't be.
Right, and a great deal of money too.
And a great deal of money, and U.S. weapons that they've either confiscated or they were given indirectly by our so-called allies in the Gulf.
Cedric, if the U.S. intention is to neutralize ISIS, or Islamic State as they're now known, is it just going to be airstrikes that are going to do it? I mean, the president was very careful to say no more boots on the ground.
And that's a big mistake. And the reason that's a big mistake is because you cannot achieve strategic objectives of that type if you're only going to use air power. And speaking as a former U.S. Air Force person, I can tell you that air power is significant. It has gotten a lot better. It has gotten a lot more precise than it was in the past, but you still need to have a ground presence of some type in order to effect true political change. And this should be about true political change in Iraq, in the northern part of Iraq, and certainly in all of the Middle East, to include Syria, because that is what really needs to happen. If you're going to stop the Islamic State from metastasizing into a much greater, more ambitious power, you have to stop it at its root. And the roots are both in Iraq and in Syria. And the failure to act in both places is what is coming home now. That failure to act is creating the situation where you have those strategic choices, which are not good strategic choices at all, and that results in us being put in a box when we don't need to be in that box. We didn't need to be in that box if we had acted earlier, and if we had really banned the specter of Iraq, that ghost of Iraq, where people are taking the false lessons of Iraq. There are some significant lessons from Iraq, some significant things not to do, but they're taking the false lessons from those, and they are really looking at a non-interventionist policy, and that is not what can happen in the world today. You need an interventionist America to a degree, along with coalition partners, in order to safeguard a peaceful operation and a peaceful world.
Okay, but Hillary, sending U.S. soldiers back into Iraq, boots on the ground, as it's called, that is, for the president, politically untenable, isn't it?
It's politically untenable, and I think strategically it has failed us going all the way back to Vietnam. It has failed us in Vietnam. It has failed us throughout the Middle East, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan. So we have a proven track record of that not working to achieve strategic objectives. And while I would agree that the United States has to be very engaged in the Middle East and very engaged in the world, the idea to be interventionist, I think, is very, very problematic, particularly in the Middle East. That has not worked for us. We have a proven track record of failure in that regard. We need to step back and not say Gaddafi has to go, Assad has to go, and now Nouri al-Maliki in Iraq has to go. Instead, we recognize that's the Iraqi government. Certainly not perfect, no government is. We agreed to sell them F-16s and Apache aircraft, attack aircraft, so that they could take care of some of these problems themselves, and then we withheld it because he wasn't doing what we thought he should be doing politically. That's not going to work. I agree we should support governments that are there. We can sell them arms as other countries do, but to intervene to try to manipulate and micromanage political outcomes has failed us over and over again.
Cedric, the president was so reluctant to use force in Syria. And he was the real reluctant warrior at that time. But now, there doesn't seem to be that reluctance in using force in Iraq.
Yes, that's true. The conversion is amazing to behold. And the reason that I think he has done that is because for Syria, the timing was really bad for any kind of interventionist policy to take place. The ghost of Iraq was very fresh in everybody's mind. And although now with Iraq it's the same country, the ghost of Iraq has worn off a bit, enough so that he can do something on the humanitarian side. And this is basically seen as a humanitarian mission for starters. But the real effect is that there's a strategic imperative to protect the Kurdish population centers and also to protect the interests of the Americans that are in Erbil, be they on the business side or on the military side. So you have all of these different factors at play, and it's something, quite frankly, that we have fought for in many respects over the last decade or so in Iraq, and that also makes it very hard for him to for the president to give up this territory in such a visible way. And so in some ways he's responding to that, rightly or wrongly, and he's doing it in a way where he is using the humanitarian crisis with the Yazidis as a way in which he can go in and actually change the strategic equation on the ground there. And that then is what his desire is. The outcome is something I'm sure that has not been calculated yet, and unfortunately we don't do a very good job of defining a strategy that can be applied to something like this. A lot of ad hoc work is going on here, and the strategy is basically not evident.
Right, Hillary, there doesn't seem to be any grand strategic objective here. The White House and the President and the Pentagon seem to be responding to one crisis after another.
and explosions all over the Middle East, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in Libya, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Syria. These are constant explosions, but I would argue many of them are self-generated, and I think in large part because of the administration's strategic failure in responding to the Arab awakening, principally in 2011. President Obama had a new shot when he came into office, and I think repeatedly has failed to put together a coherent strategic plan outcome for looking at the Middle East. And we get focused, I think, on these day-to-day problems, as horrific as they sometimes are, without thinking about the strategic picture. So the pressure, for example, to try to force Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki out has just made him turn to Russia, which literally overnight doubled the aircraft sales that we had given to Iraq. Overnight, they doubled that. Nouri al-Maliki has gotten much closer to the Iranians, and now you hear Iraqi government officials say those are their real friends, because when they needed it, when they were asking for airstrikes against ISIS, the Obama administration was withholding them until they had a more inclusive governing policy. This is not a strategy either for the Middle East or for the United States and the world, as we see power shifting from the West to the East, and we see critically important countries in the East, whether it's China, India, Russia, Iran, or Iraq. They are now, because the United States is so antagonistic to all of them, they are aligning together. That is something that is not going to turn out well for the United States.
Cedric, let's talk about tactics on the battlefield. We have these airstrikes taking place right now. As precise as they may be, I mean, how long is it going to be before ISIS starts using civilians as human shields?
Give it about 10 seconds and they'll do it. I mean, and that's a bit hyperbolic, but the basic idea is they'll learn very quickly. They already know, how Hamas is doing this in Gaza. They understand that using civilians is the key to really affecting public opinion in the world, and all that needs to happen is for civilian shields to be out there, and that would then create a situation that would be very hard for us to target, and it would be very hard for us to actually really overcome that. So the key is to work very quickly, very rapidly, to throw them off balance, and unfortunately half measures aren't going to do that. And so the military is of course taking its guidance from the political leadership in this country, and if the political leadership doesn't act quickly, we lose momentum, and that will increase the likelihood of human shields being used in a situation that could turn very, very tragic, unfortunately.
Hillary, is there an alternative to the military option right now?
In the short term, in order to save Erbil and to save American lives, the president is probably acting prudently to order these short-term airstrikes. But there certainly isn't that kind of military solution, unless we even broadened it to include Syria. I mean, there's a lot of focus here in Washington about how the president's failure to attack, to bomb the Syrian military last year in 2013 led to this increase in power of ISIS. It's really just the opposite. I mean, the Syrian military was one of the few armies battling ISIS on a daily basis. If we could actually change the focus here, and it's something that many Americans cannot even conceive of because of the political narrative laid out principally by the White House, that the Syrian government is irredeemable. If we could possibly change that and see what our interests are, which is that the Syrian government is fighting ISIS, that could lead us both to take, I think, a more coherent military strategy, but then politically open the door to talk to inconvenient but essential players, like the Syrian government, like the Iranian government, that have a lot of keys to the solution here.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Hillary Mann Leverett, Colonel Cedric Leighton, thanks to both of you for joining us.